Hello, new students. In this short video, I would like to talk a little bit about relative clauses. Defining and non-defining relative clauses, as you can see here um, on this page from the booklet. Here you have an explanation and examples of defining and non-defining relative clauses. But let me share my own examples. So, when we talk about relative clauses, then we can subclassify them into defining and non-defining. Sometimes we also call this restrictive, okay, or non-restrictive relative clauses. Now we'll see why. Look at these two sentences. My daughter who's living in Mexico is 19 years old. And the second sentence, my daughter, who's living in Mexico, is 19 years old. They look alike, right? But they are different. They mean somehow something different. In the first case, in the first sentence, in both, we have relative clauses, let me tell you. Who is living in Mexico is a relative clause, and who is living in Mexico is a relative clause. But the difference is, the first one is a defining relative clause or restrictive relative clause. What does it mean? It means that in this particular case, I need the information in this clause in order to know who I'm talking about. In this particular case, this probably means I have, let's say, two daughters. And so in order to restrict the meaning of daughter, to define which of my daughters I'm talking about, I say my daughter who's living in Mexico is 19 years old. And I could go on and say, my daughter who is here is older. So, what about the second example? In the second example, you have a non-restrictive relative clause or a non-defining relative clause. And that means that the information in the clause is not necessary to understand who I am talking about. You don't know me, but in fact, I only have one daughter. So if I wanted to talk about my daughter, I could tell you, my daughter, who is living in Mexico, is 19 years old. Okay, I'm giving you information about my daughter, but if you knew me a little bit more, you would know that when I say my daughter, I can only be talking about Emilia. All right, that's her name. Is this clear? Good. As you can see from the very first, from our two examples at the beginning, relative clauses serve the purpose of joining sentences. All right. If you look at this example, we could say that we have two sentences. I could say my daughter is 19 years old on the one hand, and on the other, my daughter is living in Mexico. All right. So by means of a relative, I can turn these two sentences into one. That's why this is such a useful structure. When we write, when we talk, we make use of relative clauses all the time. The thing is, sometimes we don't know that we are using them. So, which are the words that you will find within the relative clause? You probably know the words who, which, and that. Who, when you are referring to a noun which is human, which for non-human nouns, and that for both. I copied here some examples. I have this example. The man who attacked me was wearing a mask. All right? The man who attacked me was wearing a mask, which is the relative clause. This one, okay? This is the restrictive relative clause, not any man. I'm talking about this man, the one who attacked me last night, okay? And we could see that this comes from two sentences. The man was wearing a mask, the man attacked me. In the second case, as I have a non-human here, mask, I use which. And I could add that the mask, here I use a relative clause, which he was wearing was purple. Once again, we could say he was wearing a mask, the mask was purple. And those two sentences become one through the use of the relative. In this case, I could use here, I could say that the man that attacked me was wearing a mask, or that the mask that he was wearing was purple. Now, there is another possibility. We are talking about restrictive relative clauses. Be careful, because that cannot be used in the case of non-defining relative clauses. But in the case of defining relative clauses, you can use them, and you can also omit it. You can omit it. Let's see when you can omit that. Look at this. Is it possible to say the mask he was wearing was purple? Yes, of course. So here we have the possibility of omitting, okay, not using which or that, using zero, let's say. The mask he was wearing was purple. What about the other example? Is it possible to say the man attacked me was wearing a mask? No. Why not? Well, because the relative pronouns here, who and that, are the subject inside the relative clause. Yeah, the relative clause needs a subject. In the second case here, you have a subject, he. He was wearing. But in the first one, the subject is who or that, so you cannot omit it. Then there are other words such as whom, which is more formal, and whom is, you can use when it is an object, like in my example here. I met the woman whom he married. This comes from I met the woman, he married the woman. Okay, so he married whom. Can you see that whom is the object to the verb marry? It is not the only possibility. It is the most formal of possibilities, because I could say I met the woman who he married. I could say I met the woman that he married. And I could even say zero. I met the woman he married. So whom is quite formal, and we, let's say, restrict the use of whom to those cases where there is a preposition involved. Okay, for example, that is the girl for whom I bought the sweater. Okay, that is the girl for whom I bought the sweater. If you have a preposition here, there's no way out, you need to use whom. Okay, what about whose? Well, whose is followed by a noun. Whose, in this example, we have house. I will never forget the tears of the woman whose house caught fire last week. Okay, this comes from, I will never forget the tears of the woman's house, okay, her house caught fire last week. So immediately after whose, you need another noun, okay? Whose house, whose daughter, whose job. And then we also have the possibility of having where, when, and why. Where for places. I would like to go back to the town where I was born. Or time. That was the day when we finally met. or Y, which is restricted to the use with the reason, all right? I don't know the reason why you're here. Okay, this has to do with up to now, all these examples were restrictive relative clauses, but there are also non-restrictive relative clauses. And once again, I repeat, in that case, you cannot use that. And so you will have to use either who, which, when, where, why. And in terms of writing, you will see that non-defining relative clauses come between commas, and when you speak, there are pauses, okay? They have a very peculiar intonation contour. Well, now we have to work and see how we can put this into practice. I'm going to suggest you visit some online pages where you will find some nice exercises. Remember, you can ask questions if necessary. Thank you.